Dr. David Henderson, author and editor of a new book on economics. Why are economics so important to the average American?
Well, economics is so important because it affects so much of their life. I mean, all of life, in a sense, is economics. There's not one decision you make in your day that doesn't have some economic aspect, whether it be when you go to work, where you work, how you invest your money. Every decision you can name, anything you buy, there's an economic aspect to it.
Hello and welcome to C-SPAN, where today we're going to be discussing economics. Our guest is the editor of a new book on economics called The Fortune Encyclopedia of Economics. This is a book that takes a look at economics through the eyes of 141 top economists. If you have a question or comment for our guest, we're going to open our phones as always in just a moment. The number to call if you're watching us in the Eastern time zones is 202-628-2525. If you're watching us in the West, it's 202-783-2727. And once again, we have our fax lines open. If you'd like to fax us a question or comment, you can do that at 202-347-2111. In any event, we ask that you not call today if you've gotten through to us within the past 30 days. Welcome once again.
Thanks, Ed.
Dr. Henderson, this book is subtitled 141 Top Economists Explain the Theories, Mechanics, and Institutions of Money, Trade, and Markets. First of all, how did you go about identifying which 141 economists would be included here?
Well, I had a few criteria. I wanted people who were expert in their field. I wanted people who could write clearly and who could take editing. And I wanted people who could get to the point quickly. Most of the articles are about 4 pages long, and they really do get to the point in about 4 pages.
I was amazed by that. In the beginning, you start with some of the fundamental issues centered around economics.
Right.
What are those? Concepts. What are the major concepts that you want to introduce off the bat?
Well, one is cost. What's a relevant cost and what's not a relevant cost? For example, if you go to the store and you spend $2 for aspirin at the local corner store, but you could have gone to the supermarket and got it for $1. It still might be cheap. It might be more expensive at the supermarket because you'd have to use $2 of your time to get there for an overall cost of $3. So time is a cost, and that's something that people often ignore in analyzing public policy. Another is the whole concept of marginalism. Economists think on the margin, and students in economics have real trouble with that, but once they grasp it, they see the power of it. So it's not, most issues are not a matter of all or nothing. They're a matter of more or less. Not do you want peanut butter or not peanut butter, it's do you want a little more peanut butter, that kind of thing. So those are two basic concepts. Another one is the concept of demand. Economists believe, all economists believe, and we've got huge amounts of evidence for it, that the amount of demand is not fixed, that the amount I will demand of something will go down if the price goes up, and the amount I demand will go up if the price goes down. And that one simple concept is a very powerful one.
Your book explodes a number of myths that many Americans have about economics. One of them is that economists don't agree on anything.
Yes.
What are some of the most important things that they do agree on?
Well, you heard Mickey Cantor talk about one a few minutes ago, and that is free trade. 98% of economists in a large poll conducted, whose results were reported in the American Economic Review in 1978, 98% said they believe that free trade benefits people on average. That's news to a lot of people, that there isn't much disagreement about that. And not only do they think that free trade benefits us when other countries allow our goods in, and that's the thing Mickey Cantor emphasized, they even believe free trade benefits us when we allow other people's goods in from other countries, because our consumers benefit more than competing producers lose.
What are some of the most controversial areas of economics?
I would say the most controversial area has to do with what's called macroeconomics, the theory of the economy as a whole, what causes unemployment, what causes inflation, what causes economic growth. Even there, by the way, there's more of a consensus among economists than most people think, but there's not nearly as much of a consensus on that as there is on something like a price control that keeps the price below the market price will cause a shortage.
How would you grade the American Press Corps on its job of covering economic issues?
Fairly low, I would say. Maybe if they're lucky, a C-. But within that, I mean, I don't grade a class as a whole. I grade individuals. Bob Samuelson of Newsweek, B+ to A+, depending on the week. Dan Seligman of Fortune, A+ most of the time. It just varies with the particular individual. What it varies with is whether they stay in one area and really learn the area. If they're jumping around, they don't tend to learn much.
Did you discover any new theories of economics that have become more popular?
Well, discover is a strong word. I mean, I was pretty familiar with the areas. What I did discover, in a sense, was that there's something called the new classical theory that's kind of like economics 100 years ago, but souped up to handle a lot of mathematical techniques and a lot of new understanding of business cycles. And I'm not saying I buy it all, I'm not sure I do, but I had to take it a little more seriously than I thought I would have to at the start of the project.
You have a few articles talking about the economics of the Clinton administration. Who are some of the economists that you had write those articles, and what are some of the interesting things they told you?
Actually, I think what you mean is who are the economists in the Clinton administration, because the book was put to bed before the Clinton administration came in. Larry Summers, who's Undersecretary of Treasury, wrote a piece on unemployment. And incidentally, here's a guy in a liberal Democratic administration. The piece is on unemployment, and he's saying unemployment insurance causes unemployment. Again, it's something economists tend to agree on, but it's not something that most of the public know they agree on or even know is true. Alan Blinder, who was at the Council of Economic Advisors, is now the Vice Chairman of the Fed, wrote an excellent article on free trade. And he, in fact, in that article refuted Ross Perot's view that if we compete with Mexico, it'll be a race to the bottom. And he points out that Exhibit A against that is Japan, where at the same time wages were rising in Japan relative to our wages, the deficit was increasing. So clearly there's not a clear-cut connection between wages and deficits. Those are two. And Joe Minerick, who's the chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget, was another economist. He wrote on tax policy for the encyclopedia.
Who are some of the leading economists from the Bush and Reagan administrations who are in here?
You know, I don't think there's one economist from the Bush administration in there. There are a number from the Reagan administration. Bill Niskanen, who was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors and acting chairman, he wrote the piece on Reaganomics, which has gotten a lot of tribute as being a very balanced piece, even though he was in the Reagan administration. And Alan Meltzer, who was in the Reagan administration, wrote a piece on monetarism. And Doug Irwin, who was with the Council of Economic Advisors, wrote a piece on free trade agreements. There are a number.
In case you've just joined us, we're visiting with Dr. David Henderson, who has written or edited an important new book on economics. If you have a question or comment, we're ready to hear from you. And let's begin with our first call from Amarillo, Texas. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Maddox. How are you?
Just great. How are you?
Good. Dr. Henderson?
Yes.
The item I would like to ask you about is something that I heard on the floor of the House when Representative Helen Bentley did a special orders. And what she said was that in January of this year, there was an agreement by the Clinton administration with Japan to limit the American patents to a maximum of 20 years. And what she said was that, you know, like presently it's a minimum of 20 years, and that limiting the length of a patent agreement puts inventors at a big disadvantage because it's taken as long as 29 years to get a patent. Like for the laser, it took 29 years. And Japan did a study.
Sorry, could I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
When you say limit the patent to 20 years, are you saying the patent in Japan or the patent in the U.S.?
The United States patent.
See, the U.S. patent laws set it at 17 years.
17?
Yeah, and they have for decades it's been at 17 years.
Well, in the special orders, what Representative Helen Bentley said, unless I misunderstood, but I wrote it down right when she said it, was that Japan had done a study of United States and other countries that were really great in the early 1900s to see what it was that made it great. And she decided that what it was that made them really great was the patent system. And so that regarding GATT and WTO, in January of this year, Japan requested the United States to limit their patent system. Is it true that the laser took 29 years to get a patent?
I'm not an expert on the laser. What I can say is that it's really dangerous to point to any one factor responsible for the growth of a major economy. But the book does have an article called Japan and the Myth of Meaty. And in fact, it's one of the few articles in the book written by me. And the point it makes is that MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, is not at all responsible for Japan's growth. The things responsible for Japan's growth are mainly free market things, allowing markets, low government spending, low tax rates, and so on.
Your encyclopedia includes a number of articles about trade issues.
Yes.
What are some of the general categories that you look at under the umbrella of trade?
Free trade, protectionism, free trade agreements and customs unions, foreign fixed versus floating exchange rates. Those are the main ones.
Let's go on with a phone call from Piedmont, California. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Afternoon.
Dr. Henderson, I have a series of questions because I'm not sure if I understand the data correctly, and I'm hoping you can clear things up. First of all, my understanding is that we are at or near an all-time low dollar versus yen, and we are at roughly a 2-year low against the mark.
That's right.
My understanding is that a year ago, September, long-term interest rates were at a little below 5.5, and currently they're just under 8. Is that correct?
I can't vouch for a year and a half ago, but I can vouch for your number today.
Is that roughly right?
Yeah, that's roughly right.
Okay. And my further understanding is that we've got a falling labor force, falling savings, capital flight. Our imports are going way up. We've started to see some inventory hoarding to beat inflation. We've got 1 million families that fell into poverty last year, and we've got the median American household income declining again.
All right, caller, I need to ask for your question.
Question is, we keep hearing that the economy is growing, and what I want to know is, first of all, are those things I was outlining true, because I've read them in the media? And second, if they're true, then what does it really mean when we hear that the economy is growing, and what responsibility, if any, do you put on any given administration for the economy either growing or declining?
That's a lot of questions. I don't know about whether all your facts are true. The 1 million new people in poverty was a bit of a surprise to me. I'm not willing to say that's true or not true. I'm not sure. The facts about the yen and so on, those were true. Let me just step back from the issue. The economic system, more and more, is determined by government. So government is responsible for good or bad, mainly bad, for what happens. And, you know, in any economy where the government is directly spending over 40% of GDP, which it is in this economy if you put all levels of government together, and where it regulates the whole rest of GDP, government policy has a tremendous effect on the economy. And mostly, the more government does, the worse it's been generally.
How many articles in your encyclopedia would you say there are that speak to the range of issues that last viewer raised?
I would bet about 20 at least. There's an article on poverty that's excellent. There are articles on the exchange rates.
Capital flight, you mentioned.
Capital flight, there's one on that. Yeah, a lot of those things are covered. And in fact, that's the ideal thing, is read that book. If you get really interested in it, each article has further suggested readings at the end that you can delve more into the issue on, and so on.
Let's go to Great Falls, Virginia. Thanks for holding. Go ahead.
I've been watching the hearings on the GATT treaty, and with great interest, and I'm sort of convinced that, you know, theoretically I can see where free trade, I'm going to equate GATT with free trade here. I'm sure that's an oversimplification, but
but not a bad one.
I can see how this free trade and GATT is going to be good. That is, it'll probably increase our gross domestic product and maybe even our average standard of living.
Yes.
But I'm afraid that it may do so at the expense of exacerbating this problem that we have with a two-tiered society where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, there's one I'm pretty sure that isn't a danger. A lot of the goods that we're going to drop tariffs on, that we're going to reduce tariffs on, are goods that low-income people buy. And so, in fact, free trade generally, over history, has been much more beneficial to low-income poor people than to high-income people. I mean, the most famous example is the Corn Laws in Britain in the 1800s, where they got rid of tariffs on wheat. They called it corn over in Britain. And as a result, a whole bunch of people in Britain were able to eat at a much lower price than before.
In case you've just joined us, we're visiting with David Henderson, who's a visiting professor at the Center for the Study of American Business. That's at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the editor of the Fortune Encyclopedia of Economics, and that's what we're discussing this evening. We'll tell you a little bit more about him as we continue in the program. But before we go back to the telephones, we have a fax question for you. This comes from Phoenix City, Alabama. And the writer wrote that it's just across the river from civilization. The question is, why do economists believe that 6% unemployment is optimal for the economy?
Okay, first of all, again, that's not a bad statement. Maybe it's 5.5, maybe it's 6.2, it's around 6. And the reason they believe it, and I'll give you the exception in a minute, but the reason they believe it is that a lot of unemployment, what's that mean? It means there are people out there looking for a job who can't find one immediately that they want. It doesn't mean they can't find a job, but people are somewhat picky, and people would rather spend a few extra weeks and find the job that's a better match for what they want. That explains most of the 6% unemployment. Now, there's some of the unemployment that's due to things like minimum wage laws, and economists don't tend to believe that's optimal. Also, unemployment due to unemployment insurance extending the time they search because they get subsidized for not working. Most economists don't think that's optimal. So maybe 1 or 2 percentage points of the 6 isn't optimal, but the rest is.
San Antonio, Texas. Go ahead with your question or comment.
Dr. Henderson, I would like to ask you very quickly about Mexico, about the transformation that's taken place in Mexico, about the strategy that the government pursued in Mexico to bring its economy in order, and whether or not you agree with that strategy, and again, whether or not you think other Latin American countries should pursue such a strategy.
If by that strategy you mean the deregulation, the privatization, the cutting tax rates, and so on, yes, I'm totally in agreement with it. It works. There's an excellent article in the book, in fact, by the guy who's now the editor of The Economist, titled Third World Economic Development, that lays out in detail why free markets work, how they've worked around the world to help underdeveloped countries become developed ones.
Los Angeles, California, you're on the air.
Hello, how are you? I have 3 things. Let me see if I can express this properly. I just finished watching Mr. Cantor through his whole program, and my problem there is that his answers were half answers. Let me give you an example. He was talking about Washington State apples going to Japan under a relaxed regulation from the Japanese. But what he did not add was that getting them through their customs procedures almost negated the fact that they dropped their tariff procedures. As an example, their inspection system, and everything else. The second point.
Could I respond to that one, and then we can go to the second?
Well, let me give you all 3 of them,
okay,
because they're all related, or almost related. The second thing is that he mentioned a fairly large number of our exports of automobiles into Mexico.
Right.
What he did not mention was that they generally are automobiles that are not made there anyway, such as the high-end cars. And what he further did not mention was how many at the same time frame we imported from Mexico. And I think you'll find that our imports of automobiles were much, much greater than our exports of automobiles to the same country.
All right, caller, in the interest of time, could you sort of wrap up or summarize your question for us?
Right. Very quickly, the third thing. He had an inability, and I don't know if you have the same inability, to separate the GATT arrangement from the WTO arrangement. And perhaps you can address those 3 things. Thank you.
I'll do the best I can. It is true. I think he's hit on something, and I noticed this in the Gore debate with Perot, that not once did Mickey Cantor nor Vice President Gore ever point out the other half of things, namely that we get more goods in our country when we drop our trade barriers. I think they don't point it out because I think they don't understand the basics of free trade. They don't understand the basics of exchange. They fear that if we point out, hey, we're going to buy more things from Mexico or more things from Japan, that somehow that means we're worse off. But we're not. People gain from trade. People gain from exchange. And the more things we have coming in, that means our consumers are getting those things cheaper or getting new opportunities they never had before to buy. We're better off. I mean, ask yourself, when you go down to the store, do you judge it a successful shopping trip if you come back empty-handed?
Let's go to Liverpool, New York. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm a first-time caller. I just wanted to say on the last comment, I think that most Americans, when they go to the store, would like to see more American-made products instead of all the international-made products.
If there were enough Americans who did that, there would be stores to cater to that, but there aren't because people like you and people like me decide we'd rather pay 20% less and get a quality product from some other country.
I disagree, but I have one other question, if you could. How much of the national debt is financed short-term, and how healthy is that?
Good question. First of all, I don't know the answer, so I'm just going to give a rough guess. No, I'm not even going to give a rough guess. That's kind of crazy. A substantial amount of it is short-term. The Clinton administration was trading the idea that they could get short-term debt, pay lower interest, and they would somehow make out. They did make out in the short run. Of course, the problem is when they roll the debt over at the higher interest rates, it might not be good, and so the caller's making an excellent point. The answer, I think, is if an administration is out to tame inflation, then what they should do is produce indexed bonds indexed for inflation, and that way people are inflation hedged, and if they think they're going to beat inflation, if the government thinks it's going to beat inflation, they make out because they don't end up having to pay an inflation premium.
Your Encyclopedia of Economics talks about, among other things, the institutions that have an impact on the economy. What are some of the principal institutions that you discuss in your book? Well,
there are two senses of the word institutions. I mean, the free market itself is an institution, or no, is a set of thousands of institutions. Markets are institutions. Laws are institutions. Private property private property rights are institutions. So there are all kinds of institutions in that sense. And then there are all the government regulations, government agencies, government bureaucracies, and so on. Those are all institutions.
Let's go to Farmington, Connecticut. Nice to hear from you.
Good evening, Mr. Henderson. I have a question.
Okay.
Basically, I think free trade in academia is misunderstood as it really works in the real world. And I think the fact that we have such a tremendous trade deficit with, let's say, for instance, Japan, I don't believe there is any free trade going on. It's been proven we can deliver our agricultural products to their shores much cheaper than they can do it themselves, and they do not buy. I don't think there's any reciprocal trade. Do you feel that this is often ignored in academia? We discuss a free trade, but we don't talk about enforcement of free trade?
No, I don't. I think, in fact, if you said, what are the top 10 most free trade countries in the world? United States would be in that list, as most people here know. Another country that would be in that list would be Japan. And in fact, if you said, what are the top 5 major countries in the world that have free trade, Japan would be in that list. Yes, people can point to the rice quotas. That's a violation of free trade. People can point to some of the laws for checking imports when they come in. Those are violations of free trade. But overall, there's an enormous amount of free trade in Japan. And it's just, we don't hear that. And why don't we hear that? Because what we hear from is from all the interests in the U.S. who would have to compete with Japanese products and are trying to shift the attention.
I'll tell you very quickly that David Henderson is a graduate of the University of Winnipeg, where he received his undergraduate degree in mathematics. He received his PhD in economics from UCLA, a wonderful school, in 1976. And also, he's on leave at the moment from his role as an associate professor of economics at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Let me share a fax with you that we have received. This one is from Dr. Mark Kittleson, who writes the following. He apologizes for missing the beginning of our interview, but wants to know if any of your authors discuss what the economic future of America is regarding the huge deficit. How close are we to becoming a bankrupt nation due to our huge deficit? And is there anything that we, the large middle class can do to prepare for any future problems associated with the deficit?
Well, first of all, let me tell you what the book discusses and then go from there to tell you some of my own thoughts. There is an article on the federal debt, or on the federal deficit, I should say, that points out that the way to think about the deficit is as an intergenerational issue. And the author is Larry Kotlikoff. He's an economist at Boston University. And he points out there really is something to be afraid of, and that is that the deficit really is a transfer of income, a transfer of wealth from younger generations to older generations. And when you add in the fact that Social Security does that already, that Medicare does that already, those numbers are pretty scary. The way he puts it is that we are intergenerationally out of balance. So that's the problem. That's the main problem with the deficit and the debt. I've forgotten what else.
Well, I think principally you want to know what he can do, what we middle-class Americans can do to solve that.
Well, I would say that what we would have to do is start voting for politicians who really will. First of all, let me just say, my own view is that the government should have less money, not more. So I don't want to see tax increases. That's my view. It's not necessarily all the author's views. But given that, what I want to do and what I would like to see American voters do is vote for politicians who really mean it when they say they'll cut spending. And that's what I don't see happening.
Las Vegas, Nevada, you're on the air.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. Professor, your opening comments indicated that every decision we make, from getting up out of bed and so on and so forth every day, is an economic decision, which I concur with.
Right.
In following the approaches that various political regimes in this country have had and adhering to the rules and regulations, we follow that as an economic decision. Down the years, as these change, we have no way of protecting ourselves. For example, yesterday on C-SPAN, the president was with Mr. Kennedy in Massachusetts, commenting to the effect, we have no right to ask people to work a full day and still take care of a family and work at the minimum wage and continue to go into poverty. Yet we are telling our military people, you have to do this, and it's a voluntary army, and yet they are on food stamps. Those things are irreconcilable. How do we, as individuals, protect ourselves if we follow what the government tells us to do, and then the government changes its mind?
Well, that's a good question. How do you protect yourself when the government tells you what to do? One of the things is you figure out, maybe if it's a bad thing, how to not do it. And it is true that government officials often change their minds, and we pay for that when they say, here are the rules, here are the tax rules, you make this investment, you'll be able to depreciate it at this rate, and then they change their minds. That does hurt people, and that does make people uncertain about the future. So it's a good point. The more government creates uncertainty, the harder it is for people to make plans. Now, as far as the food stamps, I teach military officers, actually, at the Naval Postgraduate School, and I don't recall lately anyone talking about some of their enlistees getting food stamps. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I just haven't heard of that. We did hear a lot about that in the late 70s, but the military pay was increased substantially for enlistees in the early 80s.
We're talking about the Fortune Encyclopedia of Economics. It was edited by our guest, David Henderson. Aside from talking about just economic principles, you talk about a lot of very specific issues such as immigration, health care, yes, prisons, taxes, right, sports, telecommunications. Right. We'll ask you about a few of those, but we've got some callers waiting right now. Montgomery, Alabama, go ahead.
Yes. I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
We hear you just fine.
Okay. One aspect of increasing world trade that neither side in this debate is addressing is the fact that increased trade causes increased pollution, both due to transportation of goods and the fact that the goods themselves ultimately become garbage. Does the professor have any solutions to this problem?
It's not really a problem. Increased trade increases people's real income. pollution is what's called, or environmental quality is what's called a normal good. As people get wealthier, as their income goes up, they want more environmental quality. And so if you look around the world, some of the most polluted nations are the poorest nations. The richest nations are the least polluted.
You have a number of articles about the environment, but I mentioned a few other subjects, and very quickly, what do your authors say about the question of immigration?
That's a good one. I wanted the author to say something different from what he did, but I was an editor, not the author. The author said that we are net gainers. People already in the U.S. are net gainers from allowing immigrants. That's what I was hoping he thought, because that seemed to be the economically reasonable argument. We gain from having this additional labor to work with. But what he pointed out when he looked at the numbers was that the net gain to Americans already here is very small. One of the things, though, that's making that net gain very small is that a lot of them do get welfare, a lot of them do get a lot of things that the government spends money on. So there's a clear-cut solution, which is don't have welfare. Open the borders more than we do now, maybe allow an additional 1 million people a year, and don't let them have welfare.
Poplar Bluff, Missouri, go ahead.
Yes.
You're on.
I'd like to speak to the professor.
You've got him, go ahead. And please lower the volume on your TV. Go ahead.
Okay, my TV is off.
Okay.
I would like to make a suggestion that this thing is being approached from the wrong end. I think that in any world trade or any trade between nations should be barter instead of paid for. What does he think of that suggestion?
I think it's a terrible idea. Money is an extremely efficient way of engaging in trade. The problem with barter is this. Let's say you have cows and I have furniture, and you want to get rid of your cows and I want to get rid of your furniture, but you don't want furniture and I don't want cows. Then we got to find some other good we're willing to barter for to get to where we can trade with each other. There's a very simple solution. You sell your cows for money, I sell my furniture for money, and money can be used in trade to lubricate trade, to make trade very easy. And again, you know, if some of the solutions you hear, just apply it to your own life. Let's say you started bartering with people and think how far you'd get. Now, what you might have in mind is that there are all these barter agreements now that people do have, and I saw a show on TV recently about it. But really the major reason people are gaining from that is they're gaining from avoiding taxes. And I think there's a solution there, which is cut tax rates.
Let's go back to some of our faxes, and we have many of them here, and we're running short on time, but I'll tell you very quickly. This one is from Bar Harbor, Maine. The viewer wants to know what monetizing the national debt is.
What monetizing the national debt is? That's when the federal government, particularly the Federal Reserve, uses money to buy up debt that's already U.S. government debt that's in the hands of the public. That's what monetizing the debt is. If the government did, let me just point out the kind of bottom line there, if the government did that, we would have an increase in inflation. And that's what a lot of people are worried about when they look at the size of the government debt, besides the intergenerational transfer aspect.
Let's quickly go to Los Angeles, California. Go ahead.
Hi, I got a question regarding the fact that the dollar versus the mark and the yen is at an all-time low, yet our imports from particularly Japan are at an all-time high, and I'm wondering if you can help explain that dichotomy.
I'm going to try to decide whether I should try to explain it or just say I don't know, that's not my expertise. I can tell you there's never been that just simple one-to-one relationship where the yen goes up and the dollar value of the imports goes down. Beyond that, I'm sorry, I can't really.
How did you get interested in this subject?
I thought you were going to say, how do you claim to be an economist when you can't? In the subject of the encyclopedia?
And economics as a whole.
Well, I read Ayn Rand when I was 17 years old, and it really did change my life. Her novel, The Fountainhead, and I started adopting some of her ideas piece by piece, and I started arguing with my professors. And they said, well, you know, I'd get them into a corner. They couldn't answer me, but they'd say, I bet the economics professors can. And so I went and took economics and kept on going.
Let's go to Huntsville, Alabama. Go ahead.
Yes, I want to thank C-SPAN for doing a service to the U.S. citizens first. I'm a first-time caller. I'm a little nervous. But I wanted to ask Dr. Henderson. He made a comment initially that the consumer's gains are greater
right.
than the supplier's losses when you lower tariffs.
Right.
It would seem that this would have the best interest for a country then would be to have their tariffs lowered.
Yes.
Why do we need GATT?
Good question. If you lower, that's a very good question, because I think what you're getting at is if you lowered tariffs, you'd still gain even if other countries didn't. But a lot of us are greedy, and we would like them to lower their tariffs, and we would gain even more. And they would, by the way, would gain even more. That's why I like GATT. Now, I don't like some of the international enforcement mechanisms. I'm not saying that it's enough of a reason to be against GATT. On net, I'm in favor of GATT. I must admit it makes me a little nervous, but I haven't seen enough spelled out to make me believe that WTO would be a very powerful organization.
We have a viewer who writes us from Kingsbury, Texas, and wants to know, why is fractional reserve banking not considered stealing or counterfeiting?
I'm familiar with this issue way back in my past. Because if you go into a bank and you know they're using fractional reserves, it's not fraudulent. You know that they're holding some fractional reserves against your deposit, and you're taking that risk. If you don't want it, you don't have to.
Madison, Wisconsin, go ahead.
Hi, it's a very interesting discussion, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to buy the book.
Oh, too bad.
I wanted to ask Mickey Cantor, and this isn't my main comment, but I wanted to ask Mickey Cantor why Fritz Hollings is 180 degrees out of phase with the way the administration presents GATT. You know, Fritz Hollings has been in the Senate for so long. He's a stalwart of the Democratic Party, but he can't stomach the GATT bill.
Caller, do you have a question for our guest? We're almost out of time.
Okay, let me say this. The first lady who called us referred to a special order by Representative Bentley. It seems to me that the new length of a patent is 20 years, but it commences at the time or close to the time the patent application is filed, whereas today the patent is for 17 years, but that protection comes into effect when the patent is issued. So you take the case of the laser, it took 29 years to develop, the patent would have expired before the thing was perfected. That is the criticism of GATT, or of that particular element of GATT, and my facts are pretty close to being totally accurate.
All right. Thank you for the comment. We're almost out of time. Let's go quickly to Palos Verdes, California. Go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Henderson. I would like to ask a question about the trade agreement with Japan that has just been completed by our trade representative, Mr. Cantor. I would like to know, how come when I read in the Yomiuri Shimbun and Asahi Shimbun the day after the agreement was signed that the trade negotiators from Japan completely disagreed with what Mr. Cantor had said we had accomplished in that trade agreement. I would like to know what did we get out of the trade agreement, and specifically what having to do with auto parts, since they are 66% of our trade deficit with Japan, that we were able to gain. What advantage did we gain, if any at all?
I'm not familiar with all the details, but what you always gain from a free trade agreement is two things. You get more access to their markets. That's what everyone's emphasizing. What I'm trying to remind you is equally important, or probably maybe even more important, is the access we have to their goods with lower tariffs or lower import or higher import quotas.
We are just about out of time. Before you leave us, is there any general theme about economics and the direction that we're all heading in that comes through from your book?
I think the main theme that comes through is that markets work, that the free market is an incredibly complex thing that's incredibly simple to understand if you think about it a while. It handles a lot of problems. It's caused a lot of increase in wealth in this country. There's even a chapter showing that the market reduces racial discrimination. I mean, it does a lot of good things.
And there are chapters on everything ranging from apartheid to sports. I'm sorry we didn't have time to talk about sports. Yes. That was a particularly interesting article.
Yes.
We are out of time, and we want to thank you for your phone calls. We've been visiting with Dr. David Henderson, who's the author of The Fortune Encyclopedia of Economics, views from 141 top economists. Thanks for sharing it with us.
Thanks, Ed.
Come back again. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.